My name's Jim LeGrand of Messiah College's History Department, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the History Department and also the College Honors Program to this afternoon's presentation by senior history major and College Honors Program student Emily LaBianca. Emily, I think as many of us in this room know, has been a very involved and active student during these past 4 years. Here's just sort of a partial list. This doesn't even encompass everything. But Emily's been a college ambassador. She's been a history department diplomat, a history department work study student, a Smith Scholar intern for my colleague, Dr. Michael, also a work study student for diversity affairs, a judge at National History Day regional competition. Emily studied abroad during the fall of her junior year in Orvieto, Italy. And the list of, I'm starting to get a sense of why in every conversation I have with her, and when I asked for a list just to kind of remind me of all of these things, just so I wouldn't miss it, so you all wouldn't miss it afterwards, she said, quote, this is a primary source from Emily LaBianca on her own life, quote, best decision I ever made. And this year, this one got an exclamation point. She's a resident assistant on one of our first year women's floors, I believe, Whitmer 4A. Is Whitmer 4A represented? All right. All right. Emily's also received many honors during her time here. She's a member of the College Honors Program, member of the National Honor Society in History, of which we have a chapter here, Phi Alpha Theta. She won Student of the Month scholarship from the local Mechanicsburg Rotary Club. She was awarded a very generous and helpful Friends of Murray Library research grant that greatly benefited her research. And recently she presented her research on this project at the Pennsylvania NAME conference at Dickinson College. Emily also, I think many of us in this room know this as well, Emily has a heart for missions. She's been to Haiti twice on missions trips, and just recently, Emily was hired by the missions organization Reach Global to serve in Berlin for the next 2 years. During this time, Emily will be working primarily with women in prostitution and also women transitioning out of prostitution. So these are just some of the illustration glimpses of what just an all-around wonderful person Emily is. As I thought back on over the time I've come to know Emily, one thing that particularly came to mind, this was sort of the sort of guiding principle I kept coming back to, is what a lively person Emily is. Once you get to know her, she has a really lively sense of humor. You'll certainly see evidence, if you haven't seen evidence of this already, of what an incredibly lively mind she has. And one of the things I've come to realize and to know and to appreciate over the time I've worked with Emily is how alive her spirit is. She has a spirit that's very much alive to the needs of others and alive towards God. So this is sort of a bittersweet moment, right? Towards the end of the year, we have these kinds of moments. This is certainly bittersweet for me and all my colleagues in the history department. We're sorry to anticipate Emily leaving this place, but very, very excited at the prospects for how God will use her in the months and the years ahead. So now presenting her senior thesis entitled The Old School Father, Richard Pratt's Costly Vision for American Indian Empowerment. Let me ask you to join me in welcoming Emily LaBianca.
Oh man. I just want to thank, first of all, the Friends of Murray Library for the research grant. We could not have done any of this without it. And to the whole history department, who's been amazing. And Bernardo Michael, who I work for, who every time we have a work meeting, he always asks me how my senior thesis is going and wrestles through concepts with me for like an hour or so. And especially to Professor LeGrand, who has been amazing, and we've laughed so much in our meetings and sometimes just talk about religion and politics and get really off topic, but it's been so meaningful to me to work with you, and thank you so much. So, welcome. I love all of you, so it's really cool to see you all here. Okay, so just as a bit of background on who Richard Pratt is, this is a picture of him. He was born in 1840 and grew up in Indiana. When he was 13, his father died, actually was murdered, and he had to drop out of school and support his family. And when the Civil War broke out, he joined the army and rose through the ranks and finally became captain. Most people know him best for founding the Carlisle Indian School, which is 25 minutes away from here. He founded it and he served as superintendent there for a few years. He's very controversial because of this school. Most people, when they think of him, think of the phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," which he coined, and often think of pictures like these, which show the transformation of Indian children when they entered the school. This is how they came, dressed in their native garb, and this is how they left. Or at least this was the goal, and this is what they projected to the world of why Indian students should come here and learn how to be American. They couldn't wear their native garb any longer, they couldn't speak their native languages. They learned skills, industrial skills that would help them live practically in the world. So this is kind of what I had in mind when I first thought of this topic 2 years ago when I was in historical methods with Professor LeGrand, and I was trying to think of my topic for my big research project, or I thought it was a big research project at the time. Now I'm not so sure. But my friend actually told me about this, and I was like appalled. I was like, what a horrible man. I'm so excited to like go to the archive and uncover this villain, like as if no one had done that already. I didn't realize how many people have written on this. Anyway, when I got to the archive, I spent a lot of time that year at Cumberland County Historical Society, they have a lot of primary source materials and resources about Pratt. And I found a lot of letters and journal entries written by students who knew Pratt, and the tone with which they described him was one of affection and love, and they were writing these letters long after they graduated, which struck me as interesting. I also found the same tone in Pratt's own writings regarding his students. There seemed to be a real relationship between them. So that kind of took me down a peg, and I tried to like reassess what my topic actually was. And taking it up again this year, I really wanted to examine why this happened. What was Pratt's motivation in doing this? He was undeniably ethnocentric in the sense that he wanted to assimilate them. The Western culture was better in his mind. It wasn't even a cost to him that they lost their traditions, their heritage, their native culture. He didn't consider it a cost because he considered their culture a roadblock to success. But ultimately what I hope to show in the coming minutes is that he was not a power structure, but a person, and I hope to flesh him out as a person who had relationships with his students and with the Indians in his life, and also to show that what he did was shaped by a desire to benefit the American Indian and empower him and bring him equality. All words he used often. So here we go. Okay, so to lay some context, this is the symbol for the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I just want to kind of set the stage for you of what was happening at the time. Relations between American Indians and whites were pretty terrible. The government had decided to put tribes on reservations as a way to deal with the Indian problem. And this Indian problem was like the big deal. What do we do with the Indians? How do we manage them? How do we manage relations with them? There were wars and massacres, and Indians who tried to leave the reservation were forced back onto it, and many people died. It was just very terrible. And Pratt actually despised the reservation and spoke out against it in many of his writings of how terrible it is. He actually likened it to segregation in the sense that it segregated Indians from the rest of the world based on their racial difference. And also he regarded it as an obstacle to their success. So also, I would like to talk a little about why this was happening in the sense of what was the dominant narrative relating to Native Americans. How did people view American Indians at this time? And Frederick Hoxie, an American Indian historian who LeGrand warned me I would read a lot of him, and he was right. coined the term racial backwardness. And this term characterized a lot of how the majority of people, including notable speakers and authors and even activists, viewed American Indians at this time. They would refer to the white community as the dominant race, and how it was our job to help the Indians understand their problem, and how they just were inherently backward and not capable of achieving the same intelligence, the same capabilities as white children would be in school. And Pratt came against this idea very strongly. One way to think of this is in terms of like nature versus nurture. The majority of people believed that the nature of Indians was holding them back, that they were inherently by their DNA inferior to others. And Pratt believed and said over and over that experience is what shapes you, that every man is transformed by his experience, not by their DNA. So I want to illustrate this by going through a few stories from Pratt's life. And I want to start in Florida at Fort Marion. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Fort Marion prisoners, but this is kind of where Pratt's journey begins in his relationship with Indians. And I actually was able to fly down to Florida this winter and visit the fort, which was amazing. I saw all the etchings and drawings that the prisoners had made on the walls and talked to the people down there. It was really wonderful. So in 1875, there was a group of Indian warriors who were taken prisoner for their war crimes. They were referred to as the worst offenders in the war. And Pratt was placed in charge of them during the journey to Fort Marion, where they would be imprisoned, and also while they were imprisoned there. And it was terrible inside the prison. The conditions were poor. They were shackled, put in cells. There was a lot of sickness in the first few weeks, and several people died. So Pratt began to petition for more control over what was happening. And as soon as he was granted control, he removed their shackles. He clothed them in military uniforms, which became a trend you'll see throughout all of his life, clothing Indians in military uniforms. And he had them police themselves. He gave them weapons with which to police themselves. There was fluidity moving in and out of the fort. They actually started their own small business of drawing and whittling bows and arrows and polishing sea beans, and locals would come into the fort and buy their wares. So they actually had a business going, which is interesting. And one thing I think is most interesting about this is the communication that Pratt fostered between the Indian prisoners and the locals outside the fort. And he talks about this in his book, Battlefield and Classroom, and this one quote, I think, encapsulates it. And I'll just read it. "I conceived it my highest duty to correct the unwarranted prejudice promoted among our people against the Indians through race hatred and the false history which tells our side and not theirs, and which has been so successfully nursed by keeping them remote and alleging that they alone have irredeemable qualities." This is a very strong quote. The two parts I really want to pull out are keeping them remote, which is reference to the reservation and the marginalization and segregation occurring there, and alleging that they alone have irredeemable qualities, which is going against this concept of racial backwardness. So at Fort Marion, visitors were allowed every day of the week except Sundays. And actually they formed relationships with the prisoners so that the Indian prisoners would actually go sailing with the locals on various occasions. They would leave the fort and walk around the village. There was a time when a local newspaper put out something attacking the Indians and saying, "Oh, we're afraid of them. They walk around at night outside the fort where they belong." And Pratt slammed them in a letter. "These Indians have never done anything. They have wonderful relations with the people in town." So this is all nice, but you're probably thinking, "Oh, well, that's great, but they're still prisoners. Like, they don't have autonomy. They're imprisoned." Well, one thing I also thought was interesting was that from the first few months, Pratt wrote letter after letter to government officials pleading with them to let the Indian prisoners go. And these letters continued from early on in their imprisonment to the 2 years after they had been imprisoned, when they finally were released. And Pratt would say, these men want to be with their wives, they have children, they want to live on land and be self-sufficient, just give them the chance. So finally they were released with the goal of going back to the reservation, which of course Pratt was furious about because he didn't want that. What he wanted was for them to be educated, so he started to look for an educational institution to put them in. What he wanted was to put them in a northern industrial school for whites, but no white school would take them. So the only school that accepted them was a black agricultural school in Hampton Institute. And here's a picture of it. So they weren't there for very long. Pratt did not like it there. He actually, I quote him, said that Hampton fostered the principles of racism and exclusivism, and he didn't want his Indians associated with that atmosphere. He actually supported a plan to introduce Indians into the integrated school of Berea in Kentucky, which is the first integrated school in the South. And later he invited John Fee, not Fee, to visit Carlisle to talk about, I quote, that they could broaden the outlook of the white, black, and red races with the concept of the brotherhood of man. And that's like not normal for people to be saying, especially regarding Indians at this time. So ultimately, Pratt's goal was to slowly remove the young people from the reservation, educate them, so that they could go out into society, be productive, and go back and help their old. So this is all the journey that led him to found his own school, mostly because no other school would do what he wanted or accept his Indians. So now we move to Carlisle. This is a very iconic picture of Carlisle. Ultimately, the cost of Carlisle being founded is huge, and when we look at this, it's tragic to us, especially those of us who are interested in and value Native American cultures. To see how much was lost is tragic. And this is, in my title, I called it the costly vision. This is the cost. Even though Pratt himself would not have thought it was a cost, because he really truly believed that their cultures were just standing in their way and weren't valuable. But ultimately, I also want to highlight that at the time, there was no plan for Indians to remain Indians in the United States. There were two options. One was for them to slowly die off, and one was for them to be radically assimilated. And the poverty on the reservation, the wars that were taking place, all of these things were very destructive to Indian peoples at the time. And so Pratt's motivation in founding the school sprung from a desire to benefit the Indian in the environment they were at the time, which was very destructive to them. So I want to tell a story from Carlisle. It's actually regarding the Carlisle football team. So football in Carlisle became huge and actually revolutionized football. I don't know if you guys know of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. That's named after Jim Thorpe, who's up one from the left at the top, who was an incredibly famous football player in Carlisle. Before they became a big deal, they had just started playing at Carlisle, and there was an accident on the field. One of the Carlisle students had broken their legs. And Pratt was so angry, and he was like, "No, we're not doing this anymore. I'm shutting down football." And so a couple of months passed, and Pratt recounts this story of he was sitting in his office, and a group of Carlisle athletes came into his office and said, "We want football back, and here are our reasons," and listed all the reasons, and Pratt just sat there and listened. And he recounts, "The genius of their arguments almost compelled me to relax the judicial mien and release my pent-up laughter." And finally, when they were finished talking, he said, "Okay, you've convinced me. You can have football back, but under two conditions." And the first condition was that they wouldn't slug. So even if they were hit, they couldn't hit back. And this is his reason. And I love this quote, so I wanted to put it up. He told them, "Can't you see that if you slug, people who are looking on will say, 'There, that's the Indian of it. Just see them. They are savages and you can't get it out of them. Our white fellows may do a lot of slugging and it causes little or no remark, but you have to make a record for your race." And he really drilled into them, "You're a representative of your race, you have a responsibility. We could do whatever we want and there's no stereotype, but for you, you have to overcome this stereotype that has been placed on you by white people." The second condition was that in a few years, you will beat the best football team in the country. And he told them that, and he recounts that they stood there and then said, well, we'll try. And he said, no, you're not going to try, you're going to do it. And I quote him here. He said, the man who only thinks of trying to do a thing admits to himself that he may fail, while the sure winner is the man who will not admit failure. So this seems kind of like overbearing, and probably is, and I think it's also indicative of his military background, and maybe even his background of having to step up as the man of the house at such a young age. But the Carlisle football team actually did go on to beat Harvard and Pennsylvania and Cornell, the biggest football teams in the country, and also earned themselves a reputation as a non-slugger. So my next story is about Luther Standing Bear. A lot of you might have heard of him. He's actually very famous. He was a Oglala Lakota chief, author, speaker, an activist, and he came to Carlisle as a young boy. He and Pratt had a good relationship, and Pratt picked him out soon as one of the successful students. And Luther recounts in his book, My People, the Sioux, which is a really awesome book, that Pratt one day came to a prayer meeting at Carlisle and told them that he was going to choose 2 Carlisle students to go to work at a department store for a very successful man in the city, to work as clerks. And Luther Standing Bear was the boy that he chose. And he pulled Luther up in front of the whole room, and he told him, you will succeed. He said, the majority of white people think the Indian is a lazy good-for-nothing. They think he can neither work nor learn anything. Now you are going to prove that the red man can learn and work as well as the white man. And then he said, if you are a failure, then we might as well close up this school. Die there if necessary, but do not fail. And Luther remembers getting all teary-eyed and very emotional, obviously, because this is a huge burden. But he was working there for a while, and his companion, who also was a Carlisle student, dropped out. And Luther remembers thinking, I cannot drop out. I have to stick to this and prove that Indians are not quitters. And he went on to be very successful. He became chief. He was elected president of the American Indian Progressive Association. And he talks about how he campaigned through the U.S., lecturing in high schools and middle schools, quote, to show the white race what the Indian was capable of doing. And this is the last quote of his book. The Indian has just as many ounces of brains as his white brother, and with education and learning, he will make a real American citizen for whom the white race will be justly proud. As I am writing these last lines on July 25th, 1927, I am starting an Indian employment agency, which I trust will be for the betterment of the whole race. The Indian is bright and he is capable of holding good, responsible positions if he is only given a chance. And why not give the Indian that chance? So this is an interesting view on it because it would seem that Luther also believed that the cost might be worth it for the Indian to have success. Now, you can all grapple with this on your own. Do you think the cost is worth it? But I think the message here is really powerful and something that Pratt really tried to instill in his students, which is simply that you have potential, you can do it, I believe in you. In fact, if you don't do it, die trying. And that's really what Luther built his message as an adult around. So eventually, Pratt was removed from his position of influence. He came into conflict a lot with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Later in life, he actually wrote that they were a barnacle to be knocked off. He thought they were completely not necessary. In fact, they were destructive to the Indian populations. Reading Pratt's letters was honestly one of the funniest things I've ever done, because he is such a hot-tempered man, and he blasted them. And he blamed his removal from office on Francis Loop. This is Francis Loop's book. I couldn't find a picture of him, but he wrote a book called The Indian and His Problem. He ended up having a lot of influence over Carlisle after Pratt left. And he disagreed with Pratt on the way that he separated children from their families. He thought that children should, be able to cling to their native cultures. Why separate them and alienate them from their heritage and their communities? And so they disagreed on that point. And he's been praised for making Carlisle more liberal in terms of education and giving them more of a basis of their own culture instead of forcing them to assimilate so rapidly. But something I found interesting in actually going into Loop's writings, I tried to examine Loop's intent in the same way that I'm examining Pratt's intent. So we know the impact of what Pratt did. It's a legacy of assimilation boarding schools that really devastated Indian cultures. His intent seems to be more positive and well-meaning than that. So in looking at Loop's intent, I found some interesting quotes that I wanted to read. At one point, he stopped penalizing students for speaking and singing songs in their own native tongue. And I quote him in saying, "I do not consider that their singing little songs in their native tongue does anybody any harm." At another point, he campaigned for schoolhouses to be replaced with open pavilions because, I quote, "Indians are little wild creatures accustomed to the living in the open air." So it just, to me, as I was reading it, seemed to come across very patronizing and made me come away with thinking that maybe Loop wasn't doing what he did out of a respect and a value of native cultures. And I had one quote I wanted to show you just to show how Loop really did ascribe to this concept of racial backwardness, in the sense that he did not believe that you could alter what he called nature's work. And the quote is, "The Indian is an adult child. He has the physical attributes of the adult with the mentality of about our 14-year-old boy." Another quote is, "Nothing is gained by trying to undo nature's work and do it over." So here you see the dichotomy of nature versus nurture. You're not going to change them. He called Pratt kind but well-meaning but misguided in his attempts to educate and transform Indian students. And Pratt absolutely despised Loop. He called him an intriguing, mendacious adulator, which I had to Google what two of those words meant. But it means like lying flatterer. He called everything he said complete twaddle, which I'm going to say that now. And he said he knows more things about Indians that are not so than any writer of fiction on that subject I ever knew. So clearly did not enjoy Loop, did not want the school to be headed in the direction it was heading, didn't want it under his guidance. So a lot of these letters that I've been referencing and I'm about to show you more of came from Beinecke. I just wanted to give a little shout out to Beinecke Library in Yale, which Friends of Murray Library allowed me to travel up there and research there. And I found so many correspondences here that really shaped my thesis. So I really wanted to read, this is a very long quote, it continues on the next slide, but it's just so powerful, and this is Pratt responding to Loop, responding to everything Loop was doing. On the next slide, I like did some words that I thought were powerful, so they weren't really bolding. Anyway, if you would read this with me. "Surely we would agree that there is and always will be an Indian question so long as the Indian is not on an equality with the other citizens of the country. We would also agree that it is impossible for him to reach that equality and remain in any way under the supervision of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In other words, he must be a free and independent citizen, capable of competing with his other fellow citizens. I am sure, too, that we would agree that it is just as impossible for him to reach that state of real citizenship and independence under any system of training that regards and treats him as a mental, moral, physical, political, or industrial cripple. The fact that he can become a capable, useful, and equal citizen in every respect is the fundamental principle to be recognized, and that recognized he should be, so far as possible and as quickly as possible, treated like all the rest. Any system of training or education that does less fails in accomplishment in just so far as it is removed from the fullest recognition of his possibilities." And this is a letter to a senator, an obscure little letter that I found in a folder. And one thing I found interesting in my readings of Pratt was that the themes and messages he was saying in his published work, Battlefield and Classroom, which I honestly took with a grain of salt, were very consistent all throughout his life and from his published works and his private correspondences. This was written after he had fallen out of grace. Long after his retirement, he wrote letter after letter, saying clearly, I don't want power back, I just want justice. I just want justice for the people who are doing this. So he was very passionate about this. One illustration of his feud with Loop during artwork, because I just found it fascinating how much artwork has surfaced from the Carlisle Indian School. So when Loop got his influence over the school, he built the Loop Art Studio and hired a Winnebago artist, Angel Velcora, to teach art, native art there. And this was seen as a way to bring back some of the culture, teach the children about their own culture. Pratt was not having any of it. He thought that it was a complete scam. He thought that they were only doing this to make money. The students weren't actually receiving any of the money that they were making selling their wares, so he called it a scam. I have some quotes here. He said, "It emphasizes the old life and absorbs the attention of the young to the detriment of their acquiring the knowledge of civilization, and often keeping them from the field, garden, and outdoor life, so much healthier for them." And then he continues, "It perverts what was a joy and pride of the mother or daughter in seeing husband, father, or child wearing the products of their own thought and industry into a commercial grind." And this quote just fascinated me too, because he's referring to the artwork created by Indians as being a source of joy and pride. And I especially want to pull out the word pride, because I think this is crucial to his philosophy regarding Indians, that they should have pride, that they should have dignity. And all throughout his life, whenever he noticed a skill or talent that an Indian in his life had, he fueled it with resources. As soon as he found out that these students wanted to play football, he got them the best coach there was. As soon as in Fort Marion, going back a few years to Fort Marion, he noticed that these prisoners could draw. In fact, sometimes they're referred to as the Fort Marion artists, not the Fort Marion prisoners, because of the beautiful artwork that they drew. And as soon as he saw that, he went and ordered colored pencils and notebooks for them in the colors that he knew they wanted. And it's also important to remember he wasn't making any money off of what they did. They kept all the money that they sold from their wares. And that's just struck me as interesting as well, because I feel like in my understanding of Pratt and how I've seen him represented in secondary source literature, he's often seen as being very anti-art. A lot of the artwork that came out of the Carlisle Indian School, which I'll pass around in a minute, people wondered if maybe it was done in secret. I honestly don't know, because I couldn't find much on it, but I do know one story of a friend of Carlisle named Mrs. Joseph LaRoque, who sent a gift of colored pencils and paper and paints and drawing books to Carlisle, which Pratt accepted, and hung her picture on the wall. She was a great friend of Carlisle. And here are a lot of artwork drawn by the students. I'm just going to pass it around. They're really beautiful. I also have some pictures here of the art created by the Fort Marion prisoners. They always sketched in bright colors, and so he particularly asked for bright colors when he sent out a telegram asking for supplies for them. So to finish up, I wanted to highlight another genre of Pratt's correspondence over the last period of his life. At the same time he was writing all of these angry letters to senators and government officials about how horrible Luke was, he was also carrying along letter correspondences with students who he had formed lasting relationships with. And this is what really helped shape my thesis and bring me out of the understanding of Pratt as a villain and into the understanding of him as a person with relationships. So I just want you to read these. This one is from Luther Standing Bear, and then Pratt responds at the bottom. And Luther writes, "The Alumni Association of the Carlisle Indian School, in grateful appreciation for the great work in Indian education originated by you, and greetings and wish you health and long life." And he responds, "I'm deeply touched by your gracious message. My earnest expectation is that the great excellence of past achievement by the Carlisle alumni will be far advanced until the beacon of it removes every obstacle to widest training for independent, useful citizenship for all Indian youth." Kind of sounds like an excerpt from his book, but it does end with "your old school father," which I found very powerful. This letter is a lot more personal. It was written also by Luther Standing Bear. You see it, the letterhead at the top says, true authority on all questions concerning the Sioux Nation. And it reads, my dear friend, as I have been away, it was impossible for me to write to you sooner, but I want to congratulate you on the anniversary of your 80th birthday. This is from one of your first students at Carlisle School, October 7th, 1879. If you ever come to the beach, I would like to very much have you call on me at my place of business, that is the Indian Archery. If you care to call me up anytime, my telephone number is 610-22 minutes. Again, I will wish you many happy returns of the day from your pupil and friend, Luther Standing Bear. And then the last letter I want to show you. I could not for the life of me decipher the name of this person, and I spoke with LaGrand about it, and I'm in the process of trying to find out who it is from archivists at Beinecke. But it's clearly from a student, and the letter reads, Dear School Father, I could not written to you without calling you School Father. As I look back to 33 years ago, I remember each one very distinctly, from the man on the bandstand down to the smallest kid in the small boys' quarters. It seems as though once a great family, now scattered all over the world, perhaps never to meet again in this world. But as for me, I hope our souls' reunion will take place in our heavenly home above, will always be my prayer. I am glad that we are still among the living and wish that we all be blessed with many more years. I very much regret that my work prevented me from attending the conference at St. Louis, whereby missing my chance of seeing you and Mrs. Pratt. Please accept my sincere greetings. I am very sincerely your friend. So I just want to end with this picture of Pratt with his students. Now, do these letters make Pratt's work at the Carlisle Indian School good? Not necessarily. Do we have to grapple with what was done there and the impact that it had? Yes. And as someone who is fascinated by and deeply interested in American Indian cultures, I am devastated by what happened and how much was lost. But I hope that that this project has allowed me to show you a different side to someone typically seen as a villain, to flesh out a person in history as opposed to a power structure, and to highlight that what was done out of affection and the desire to benefit, whether or not that was its impact. And I mean, if only to understand the complexity of humans, this project has helped me do that, and the complexity of people in history that we study, this project has helped me do that. And it also gives me an unlikely person to inspire me with his willingness to go against dominant narratives and stereotypes, and to promote reconciliation between groups historically alienated from each other. So, thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I'm sure you're probably aware of this whole presentation reminded me of the whole burkini controversy in France. Are you aware of that?
What is it?
The burkini controversy in France, where basically the Muslim women, there was a bathing suit designed so that they had like a little hijab and stuff, or a burqa attached to the bathing suit. And there was this whole controversy that they wanted to ban that on like French beaches. I wasn't sure, like this reminded me of that, and I wasn't sure if you were aware of it, and if you were, did this new research in this have any influence on like how you saw like that controversy or even other controversies, because racism being such a huge issue in this country right now is something that's widely talked about, how this might influence your perceptions of people and racism and the views that
Yeah, totally. I think it definitely informs my opinions of like controversies like that. I don't really know too much about that, but a lot of things similar to it that are happening now. One thing I tried to ask myself a lot was, what is the other option? Like, how beautiful would it have been to have this affection and relationships, and also a value for difference, and not trying to change the other person. And even like the motto of transformation and of which was Pratt's desire to transform someone. Yes, there was relationship and affection, but there was also the desire to transform someone else to fit your standards. So I mean, it's a hard topic, but in like understanding that and trying to relate it to today, I guess just striking a balance between love and fighting for difference.
Did you find yourself like maybe with certain people and their views, did you find yourself probably empathizing with different points of view? Or
In the sources?
in the sources, yeah, obviously now, but even today, in our modern context, and more talk about racism. I don't know.
Empathizing with certain points of view.
Yeah. Like, I don't know, like that controversy sort of like I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, I don't really know. Honestly, it's kind of made me back away from taking positions very quickly,
Yeah.
more than it has given me a certain position on a subject.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
Like you start backing away from a position and kind of start to empathize.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So like in your research, I don't know if you actually like found this or not, like you're right, but like I know you like mentioned briefly how Pratt was like talking about like respecting or like how they had pride like in making their objects. Like did he actually disrespect their culture at all? Or like not disrespect, but I know like he has a reputation of like assimilating, like getting rid of their culture, but like do you have anything because like obviously the other guy, whatever his name was, like didn't respect their culture, but like Pratt, it kind of seems like, I don't know, like did you find anything about just what he thinks other cultures specifically? Or, like,
Yeah, that's an interesting question because that is like a big difference between Loop and Pratt is
yeah.
the patronizing nature with which Loop talks about. I mean, honestly, I really do believe Pratt did not see any value in their culture in this particular situation that they were in. And in every sense that he talked about it, it was to get rid of it. Like, I mean, he said, as far as the Indians are concerned, I'm a Baptist because I believe in immersing the Indian completely in American culture. That's a quote from him. And yeah, that's why that quote especially was very fascinating to me because it did seem to bring value to something from their culture, where Luke was treating it with a bit of more patronizing nature. But in the end, I think he was really just concerned with their success and their mobility and autonomy, and their culture was standing in the way of that. Yeah.
Alright, one. Doing research, like, what motivated this guy? Did you glean that from sources? Like, you talk about like after he got some power, but like, what even motivated him to get to a position where he wanted to help these Indians? You know, who he did.
That's a good question. Well, he had like some relationships with Indians before Fort Marion, but I honestly think Fort Marion was instrumental in helping him, and you kind of see that in his writings, helping shape his view of what he wanted to do later, and seeing what they were capable of, and you kind of in his writings you can see like his discovery of, and then they did this, and then they had this talent, which we did this and sold their wares, and so I think Fort Marion was instrumental in his journey, but I started it at Fort Marion, but he had a history with them before. He was in the Army. He had relationships with Indians and with tribes and before Fort Marion. So I think relationship was the basis for what he did. In fact, he criticized Luke, who said that his basis was that I came face to face with the Indian, and Pratt said, no, I've been face to face with the Indian. You haven't. Like, I don't know where you're getting your information. So I think relationship and contact was the basis for his philosophies.
So Emily, it sounds like it was almost accidental, or whatever you want to call it. Just that was his assignment to take the Indians. So it wasn't as if he was coming in with some kind of religious or any kind of ideological motivation about creating good Americans, or it was just the encounter.
Right.
He got assigned to this job, and it shaped. Yeah, interesting.
And I think he was assigned because they knew that he had relationships with tribes of Indians. I think that was a motivating factor. But yeah, it was.
Yeah.
He didn't necessarily even ask for it, so.
I'm wondering about this notion of citizenship that showed up in several press quotes. And it got me thinking, no wonder he's in conflict with the BIA, because that exists because the natives are their own nation in contractual treaty relationship with the United States. So I began to wonder, did he have thinking as if the Native Americans were to be immigrants? As in fact, like an immigrant would come from Europe, you're no longer German, you're no longer English, you are American. And so he's calling them to a kind of immigration. And I don't hear Luke using language of citizenship. So I'm wondering, is that a linchpin of his thinking? That in fact, they are citizens and therefore they need to assimilate because of that. And others say, let them be who they are, they're not citizens. So citizenship seems underneath a lot of this. Am I missing something? Or?
Yes. In fact, there's a large portion of my paper dedicated to the idea of citizenship. And in fact, when he was trying to convince, I forget his name, it was an official to grant him Carlisle barracks to found the Carlisle Indian School. The man he was talking to was a German immigrant, and Pratt actually used that analogy by saying, imagine if you had come to the US and they had put you on a German reservation, separated from everyone else, would you have been able to succeed? If you are allowed that, how much more should these Indians who were here far before we were deserve to have that? So yeah, he used that often. Yeah.
It's interesting. Very 19th century, it seems.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any further questions for me?
Yes.
How's the result of the school after Luke became, after Luke became leader?
How was it resolved?
Yeah, no, how was the result? Like, how did the school function? Was it still functioning? How was that different from when Pratt was the head of?
Actually, things went really downhill after Pratt left. A lot of the stories of abuse and of maltreatment occurred after Pratt left, and the school was eventually shut down because it wasn't doing its job anymore. Other schools were born out of that in different parts of the country, so it kind of like left a legacy, but Carlisle itself was shut down fairly soon after Pratt left. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so many directions and so interested in kind of what you're unveiling for us. But I'm just wondering if, it seems so appropriate to what we are experiencing right now, culturally. And I'm wondering if, and this is, what you just said, Sharon, was that, no, this makes me look more closely at the particulars, as opposed to coming up with a litmus test for authentic engagement with an issue or people. But I'm just wondering if you think that, what are some of the things that you would look closely at? And what are some of the things that you would encourage us as citizens to look more closely at before we respond categorically? So I'm just thinking about, there are all these categorical responses going on right now, where people don't even get close to a subject before they start, protesting, and a lot of it has to do with a kind of sanctimony that has nothing to do with a genuine engagement, but more to do with self-regard. And so I'm just wondering if coming out of this experience, you have any encouragement to us to say, here are some of the things I would do to get closer to the situation, to make judgments and decisions. Does this transfer that way for you at all, or is it too soon to be answering that question?
I mean, I think I'll be thinking about it for a long time, but yeah, I think we can take a lot away from it. And I like what you said about categorizing. I think in two ways this project has showed me how not to categorize people. And one of them is this idea of racial backwardness, of attributing one quality to an entire group of people. And everything, I've read so much of Pratt, and so much of what he says is, do not judge someone based on a whole, do not judge someone based on their race. People are shaped by their experiences, every man is different. All of those things are so powerful, and I think we could learn a lot from that right now. And the second way is the sense in which many people, sometimes historians, but sometimes people who don't really know about the topic very well, categorize Pratt because of what he has done and say, this man is a villain, and they don't look deeper. And so I think on the one hand, we need to not categorize people based on their people group, based on where they're from or who they are, how they were born. On the other hand, I also think we can't categorize people who make decisions that we strongly judge as wrong and judge their intentions, because Pratt's intention was so far different from his impact. And all I saw was the impact when I started studying this, and then slowly I got closer and closer to his intention and his well-meaning. The reason he did all of this and what motivated him, and that was inspiring to me too, to really not jump to conclusions about a people group or about a person that you might vilify. So, but yeah, it's a really good question. I'll be thinking about it for a while.
Can I ask a question? Decades before this happened, the Cherokee had their issues down south, and they started to become white, and that didn't work out real well for them. Did either of those two gentlemen know like that story and what really happened, to the Cherokee, and how they were pretty much wiped out as they were pushed across the country to Oklahoma? Would either of them been aware of that, and would that thinking have been good or bad, that here was this group of Indians that chose and tried to live that way and actually became educated, created their own alphabet for their people? Did these two guys ever, in your research, come up with any discussion of that? Or?
Not that I've seen, no. And I wish I knew more about that, but yeah, I haven't seen much discussion regarding that. I'm sure they would have known. I mean, especially Pratt, this is a specialty, and yeah, I'd go back and look at that. It's interesting.
You mentioned Luther, one of the students, and his primary source. I was wondering, was there any other students that graduated from Carlisle Indian School during Pratt's time that had a different opinion of him?
Yes, well, there were success stories and then there were failures. And I think the people who, failures, quote unquote, according to Pratt, there were a lot of students who went back to their tribes and they didn't have successful positions like Luther Standing Bear. I think the people who succeeded are the ones whose voices we tend to hear because they had positions in which they could write letters and say, oh, come to my place by the beach and visit me. But the ones who had a different experience of Carlisle disappeared. And so there certainly were students who had different experiences and who weren't benefited by the education and who went back to their tribes confused and they had no loyalty to anyone. And yeah, there were very different stories.
When they took the children, where were the parents? And did the parents volunteer the kids, or how did that work?
Yeah, Pratt went to the tribes and campaigned for this school, and he has pages and pages of what he said to them. He told them, you're going to be ripped off by white people who you can't understand. You can't read what they're writing. Your children can help you. Give me your children and I will educate them to come back and help you. And he ended up winning the support of two very prominent chiefs who offered their children, and then other people started to follow. But he really needed to gain the support of someone who was well known and prominent, and he did.
All right.
Just one question. Would you say that this project is a kind of an historical exploration of whiteness in the 20th century? While you have looked at Pratt and tried to understand his human being, which is the task of the historian, would you fit in within that larger kind of a study? Is that
Did
something
you say
explore?
more about like the historical exploration of whiteness?
No, whiteness is a term that's used a lot nowadays and
Yeah.
keeps coming up. But these terms need to be unpacked within a historical context in time and space, mind and body. So here is an instance where certain values are being imposed on an entire community. So would you consider this to be, rather than use the term whiteness in a very vague sort of way, where you're actually trying to explore it in a more intentional fashion, and is that something that you would be comfortable talking about in a way?
Yeah, I think I don't think it's possible to not talk about it because it's so, that's the reason Pratt is such a controversial figure because of his, and I use the word ethnocentric because I can't really come up with a better word, but just the sense in which he really truly believed that the Western civilization was better. There's really he didn't even have to argue it because he just assumed that everyone agreed with him, and most people did. But it was interesting to me because the cultural superiority and the racial superiority were different with Pratt in the sense that he didn't believe in racial inferiority. He believed in cultural inferiority, and that led to like the devastation of a lot of Indian cultures. But there was that difference in the sense that he pushed back against the narrative that they were racially inferior, which I think makes him interesting. But I don't think I could have a paper like this without talking about that.
If I could follow up, as you were doing your research, did you use any theoretical frameworks for reading this kind of primary document? As you're sharing, I'm struck because I think you do an amazing job. You're so exhaustive in your reading of Pratt. But I'm also struck by the fact that many slave owners talked about their slaves with the same kind of affectionate tone, and thinking that what they were doing was really good for the slaves. And so I was wondering if you use any kind of secondary framework for interpreting Pratt through that context of really being equally paternalistic because he wanted to save these people, but at what cost?
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And as far as using a specific framework, I think just the secondary source literature that I read about Pratt helped supplement that. Mm-hmm. But that's interesting you bring that up. One of the first classes I ever had at Messiah, I think it was Dr. Fia, and he was like, okay, now we're going to examine the doctrine of a slave owner, and I know what you're all thinking, but don't judge him. Just read it. And I was like, okay. And I think that's an interesting way of describing it because none of us would argue that a slave owner would be correct in his opinion that he was doing something good for the slaves. And I think most of us would understand that this was not beneficial to the children in the sense that they were being completely alienated from their heritage. But even just that point of going back and seeing what the intention was and the complexity of the situation was important to me.
Yeah.
But that's a great point. I think one thing that struck me as I was reading the letters of students was that many of the letters I found were written years and years after Carlisle, and a lot of the previous students were now in positions of authority and were activists, which just struck me as interesting, that they would still hold Pratt in a high regard while campaigning for Indian rights. Not to say that, and even Luther Standing Bear had strong critiques of Carlisle, and he wrote about them in his book. We should have been able to speak our language. Why weren't we allowed to translate our language into English? Strong critiques of Carlisle, but still, as you saw, wrote to Pratt when he was 80 years old. So, but that's an excellent point.
Further questions? Well, if not, let's once more thank Emily LaBianca.